Hello, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Michael Granado, and I'm going to be taking this video to give you a very brief and broad overview of a very specific concept within the context of a very obscure philosopher. I'm not sure if this introduction makes a lot of sense. So, I'm going to be talking about the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who happens to be the focus of my PhD thesis. Now, Bachelard is a lesser known early 20th century French philosopher. He's writing at the beginning of the 20th century. And what's really interesting about Bachelard, at least from my perspective, is that you have all of these really tremendous different influences that are happening. What I mean by that is you have radical developments in early 20th century physics. Of course, I'm talking about Albert Einstein, the development of relativity theory, but also, of course, the development of quantum mechanics. Heisenberg is also happening around that time. Within early 20th century France, you have some of the most monumental philosophers of French history. I have in mind, I don't have here because, of course, they're dead, but Henry Bergson. Bergson is wildly popular by the late 19th, early 20th century. And then on the other hand, I don't know if I want to say other hand, but another big influence coming from a very different area of study would be the development and the emergence of psychology as a distinct scientific discipline. And another major philosophical influence would be the rise of phenomenology. So within the writing of Bachelard, you have all of these different divergent influences, and Bachelard's going to take little pieces of each, or sometimes lots of pieces of one, and have it influence what he has to say about various subjects. But Bachelard is one of those figures that has been largely ignored or overlooked by what we would call the Anglophone tradition, the English speaking tradition in philosophy. And I forgot to mention, another big influence is what we would call French historical epistemology. Specifically, this is in reference to the philosophy of science. But Bachelard, to give you a sense of perspective, how I would phrase his influence on the French tradition specifically, Bachelard is to French philosophy as maybe Karl Popper is to English-speaking philosophy of science. He's one of the paramount, I guess I would say, paramount founding figures. Feel free to disagree. He has tremendously influenced not just the students that he taught, some of his students, of course, being Michel Foucault, but also contemporary French philosophers such as Michel Serres, as well as, I mean, you could argue others that I won't go into detail here because that's not really the point of this video. What I would like to focus on, in addition to being deeply influential on the French tradition, Bachelard is also one of these philosophers who has a very wide breadth in terms of the subject matter and the content that he's writing about. If you are an American, as most of you who watch my videos are, or if you're from the English-speaking world, so to speak, if you are familiar with Bachelard, what you are probably familiar with is his writings on the branch of philosophy that we would call aesthetics. This is one of those weird aspects of history that I can't really quite put my finger on. It's just one of those things that it just kind of happened this way. But so Bachelard has published, I want to say like 20 something books, numerous papers, most of what has been translated into English. And as a result, most of what the English speaking world knows him for is his writings on aesthetics. I have in mind here The Poetics of Space and The Psychoanalysis of Fire. I mean, that's Poetics of Space is probably his most popular work. I mean, if you just go to YouTube and put in Gaston Bachelard, the videos that are going to come up, unless they're my videos, are going to be talking about the Poetics of Space. That's probably the most widely read and widely distributed amongst his works. But the concept of rhythmanalysis comes from his even lesser known works that have actually been translated into English over the past 20 years or so. And that's his work on time. Now, to give you a sense of where all all of this fits in. So Bachelard actually starts his early philosophical career writing about subjects related to epistemology, specifically the epistemology of science. What we would classify today is roughly speaking the philosophy of science. But the interesting thing about the early 20th century French philosophers is that they were deeply influenced by and took a lot of consideration of the history of science. The closest English parallel that I can give as an example here would be Thomas Kuhn in his Nature and Structure of Scientific Revolutions. If you've read that, probably without a doubt, one of the most influential works within the history and philosophy of science. But within the French epistemological school, the historical epistemological school, history is kind of taken as the basis and the foundation for what they're going to say about the philosophy of science in a way that's not really evident in the English speaking world until a bit later. You can see this, for example, if you compare and contrast Karl Popper to Bachelard in terms of how they're reaching the conclusions that they're reaching. For Bachelard's going to make more references to the history of science and take into consideration more the historical development of the sciences than Popper will. Popper's almost exclusively focused, for example, on contemporary science, specifically Einstein. Bachelard is too, of course. Einstein will be one of its biggest influences, but Bachelard's also going to bring into conversation the origins and the development of modern chemistry and how chemistry relates to, for example, the history of alchemy. All this other historical data is going to come into play. And you have kind of two, if you're looking at Bachelard's work as a whole, there are kind of two camps, two categories that we can place on him. Is one is his epistemological writing. This is writing about the epistemology and the history of science. You can see this in early examples. Another thing that Bachelard really likes to do is to take specific examples from the history of science, focus on that, and then kind of elaborate general philosophical points. You can see this in his early work, such as the inductive value of relativity, in which he's talking about some of the philosophical implications of relativity, but it's a very specialized work. Bachelard has a background in mathematics, so he's kind of unpacking the transition from Euclidean to non-Euclidean geometry and explaining, for example, what this means philosophically speaking. You also see this in early works such as the evolution of a problem in modern physics, and in later works such as the rational activity of contemporary physics. Now, these are very specialized, but he also has general works dedicated to the epistemology of science, such as the New Scientific Spirit and Applied Rationalism. In terms of his philosophy of time, we're really talking about two books that I have pictured this side pictured on the screen here, but I also have physical copies. And what's interesting is these are Bachelard published these in the 1930s, so towards the beginning to middle of his career. Intuition of the Instant published in 1932, and the Dialect of Duration published in 1936. Sorry. So both of these works on time are kind of sandwiched in between his epistemological writing and his writing on aesthetics. And what's interesting about his philosophy of time, now, this is meant to be a general overview introduction to Bachelard's concept of his philosophy of time and his idea of rhythm analysis. If you have a familiarity with Bachelard already, on the off chance that any Bachelard scholar watches this, they might disagree with some of the things that I'm going to say here in a second. Hopefully they haven't disagreed with what I've said thus far, although you never know. And of course, feel free to, I'm always more than happy to talk about disagreement. And if you are a Bachelard scholar, there's like 10 of us in the world who are actively writing about Bachelard. Reach out. Let's have a chat. Send me an email, right? So what I find interesting about Bachelard's philosophy of time, and this is taken from a book called Gaston Bachelard, Philosopher of the Surreal, by a philosopher named Kotovich. Kotovich argues that Bachelard's philosophy of time kind of is this bridge between his epistemology and his aesthetics. and kind of provides the central focus of his overall work. And the reasons for that extend well beyond the scope of this video. Maybe I'll cover that. That's a very specialized topic, but of course, so is rhythm analysis. But I might make a separate video on that. But part of the reason for this is that his work on time will bring together a lot of what he has to say about epistemology and in some way provide kind of the basis for what he's going to say in his works on aesthetics. But his concept of rhythm analysis specifically comes from his dialect of duration. Even more specifically than that, it comes from the last chapter. Chapter 8 of his dialect of duration is dedicated exclusively to this idea of rhythm analysis. Now, this video is on the one hand a little bit of a disservice because I kind of conceptualize Bachelard's philosophy of time. I've had to systematize it in my own head in order to make sense of it. And so his philosophy of time is kind of building up from certain epistemological considerations that we'll talk about here briefly, related to the relationship between science and philosophy. Then we have some positing of some general metaphysical principles, I think. And all of this is leading up to, I don't want to say a phenomenology of time, because as we'll see, Bachelard will raise some problems with the concept of phenomenology. But all of this is kind of building up to provide a sort of explanation, a therapeutic explanation about how we experience time and why that is important. So we're kind of talking about the higher level things in this, or I'm going to be talking about the higher level things in this video. If you're interested in the more metaphysical considerations, I do have several other videos about Bachelard's philosophy of time. I would point your attention. I made a video specifically talking about Bachelard in relation to Bergson, and their main point of divergence is going to be over epistemology / metaphysics. So I kind of outline Bachelard's central ideas in that video. If you're interested, go watch that, and you can come back here and maybe this will make a little bit more sense overall. But anyway, let's briefly cover some of that. So the simplest way to put this first point, to talk about Bachelard's understanding of the relationship between science and philosophy, is that Bachelard will talk about this very extensively in a book that he wrote called The Philosophy of No, which is related to the epistemology of science. But the thing to understand about Bachelard, and this relates to his personal background as well, Bachelard is coming to philosophy from a scientific basis and background. He was actually a science teacher, what would be the equivalent of, in the United States, high school was the equivalent of a high school science teacher. But in terms of education, his education was in chemistry / physics. It was different from what a chemistry degree today would look like, because we're talking early 20th century. But this kind of carries over into Bachelard's epistemological writing, because in The Philosophy of No, Bachelard will make the argument that, on the one hand, science is not dependent upon, nor does it need to appeal to philosophy in order to epistemologically justify its claims. Science kind of does its own thing and approaches knowledge in its own way that doesn't need to be philosophically justified or verified. That's to say, science isn't beholden in any way, shape, or form to philosophy. We don't need to philosophically elaborate on scientific concepts in order for those concepts to make sense. But another implication that Bachelard derives from that is actually science's approach to reality, science approach to understanding the world, should actually provide the basis or the beginning point for philosophy. And in cases in which they disagree, and this will be extremely important for Bachelard's philosophy of time, because one of the big epistemological questions in the philosophy of time is, how exactly do we know about time? And this is where Bachelard will diverge from Bergson and even other thinkers such as Husserl. But Bachelard's going to say, for example, with respect to time, that science reveals some deep fundamental truths about time that we have to make sense of philosophically, and to disagree with what science has to say about time because of our philosophical positions is a fundamental kind of categorical error that he sees a lot of philosophers committing. So for Bachelard, science is epistemologically, ontologically superior, so to speak. That might ruffle some feathers, but science provides, or ought to provide, the basis for our philosophy of science. We ought to derive our philosophy of science from science itself. And this will also put him at odds, for example, with figures like Karl Popper. Popper's principle of falsifiability, he does give a singular example of relativity, but in general, if you read Popper's work, there's not really a lot of reference to how science itself operates. If you compare and contrast Popper, for example, to Thomas Kuhn, who's more so a historian of science, who's basing what he says off of a lot of historical data, Popper's just not doing that. So for what Bachelard's saying is that our philosophy of science should really look more like what Kuhn's doing, although Bachelard didn't comment or read Kuhn or Popper, so I'm confusing myself. But what we say about science should be derived from how science actually operates and what science actually says about itself, not what philosophers say about science, if I'm making any sense here. So based on that, what Bachelard sees as one of the major developments within the philosophy of time is what happened to the concept of time in the early 20th century. The first major development that occurred, of course, is Einsteinian relativity. I have several videos on my channel. There's one video, Einstein versus Bergson, talking about the difference in position and the impact that Einstein had on the philosophy of time. But one of the ways in which Bachelard interprets Einsteinian relativity is this introduction of discontinuity into the concept of time. And this is really in contrast and objection to Bergson. So again, and I have, I think, 3 or 4 videos on Henry Bergson and his notion of time, if you want to get more context there. But Bergson presented a very popular picture of time, and this is Bergson's the primary philosopher that Bachelard is responding to. And so this conception of time that Bachelard is forming is kind of being formed over and against Bergson. But Bergson held that that time is rooted in duration on the individual level, but also on the metaphysical level. And Bachelard, with relativity, with the rejection of absolute simultaneity, Bachelard sees time as rooted in the instant, that time is rooted to the individual. Bachelard interprets relativity to say that each individual has their own time relative to themselves, and that there is no absolute sense of time, and as a result, there can be no absolute sense of duration. Instead, Bachelard argues that on a experiential level, in terms of how the individual experiences time, that the time is rooted in the instant, and the instant, if you can think of, and maybe I should have put the picture up here, the Macalsian intersection of the singular point with the past before it in the future above it. The instant is the moment of time at this particular place, in this particular section. It's our conscious experience, the awareness of the now point of time that you are now experiencing as you watch this video, and that I'm experiencing as I record this video. Now, there's kind of different levels of consciousness of time, but we'll get to that when we actually talk about Bachelard's concept of rhythm analysis. So time for Bachelard is inherently discontinuous, and as a result, time is rooted in the instant. And this leads Bachelard to posit a form of relationalism. At least that's the category that we would label it in the philosophy of time. So in the philosophy of time, you have 2 general camps. One would be a form of substantivism, which argues that time has particular characteristics. The most obvious characteristic would be that there's a distinction between the past, the present, and the future, and that these tensed distinctions are real in some fundamental way. And that's in distinction from a relational standpoint to time, which understands past and future in relation to the present moment, meaning that past and future don't have any ontological substance to them. They're defined purely in their relation to another event. And Bachelard, I think, can justifiably be categorized as a relationist, although that's not a word that he would use. And these modern concepts in the philosophy of time would be are kind of anachronistic to apply to Bachelard's writing, but it helps us to make sense of them as a whole. So within Bachelard's Dialect of Duration, you can kind of see this as I mentioned before that Bachelard's philosophy of time as a whole can kind of be seen as a cumulative argument. It's systematic in the sense that it's building up from epistemological and metaphysical principles. And the same is the case within the book, The Dialect of Duration. Bachelard's going to start by critiquing Bergson's notion of duration, that duration is the point, is the building block of time, of our experiential understanding of time, by arguing that duration is rooted in a construction, that there's a constructive element, a basic inherent constructive element to our understanding of time. This has a metaphysical basis in the fact that time is inherently discontinuous. But in the Dialect of Duration specifically, he's moving away from epistemological and ontological considerations that are rooted more so in science itself, in principles and ideas that he derives from physics, and kind of moving into the realm of psychology, because ultimately what Bachelard wants to argue, you have this big question within the philosophy of time. How do we bring together and reconcile the picture of time that's presented by physics with our kind of understanding of time? And in the last video I put out, I said that in philosophy of time, this is like the distinction between manifest time and physical time, because manifest time appears to us in very different ways than it does in physics. And Bachelard rightly identifies that the strength of Bergson's position, Bergson arguing that time is rooted in duration, the strength of that position comes from the fact that it kind of very much so aligns with our perception of time. In Bergson's debate with Einstein, his primary rebuttal is that we all feel as if we endure. That's how we understand our lives, as our past is kind of building up or leading to the present moment, and we can anticipate how that trajectory is going to go into the future. And for the first part of this book, Bachelard's argument is not to deny that we experience duration. It would kind of be a fool's errand to deny that we experience duration, but to try to get us to understand that even that experience of duration is kind of based off of a generalization. And in order to explain how that's the case, he makes heavy references to music. Now, I don't have a music background, so my explanation of this might not necessarily be up to par. But when you listen to a song, when you listen to a particular composition, a trained musician, I can't because I don't have that background, but a trained musician can hear independent notes. A song, a tune is made up of singular musical notes that taken together compose the whole song. The analogy that Bachelard draws is between music and time, in that our understanding of duration, what we perceive as our experience of duration, is composed of individual instances in the same way that a musical score is composed of individual notes. But when we hear the song, we hear it as a whole. And for Bachelard, the argument is when we look back at our lives, we look back at it as a whole, although if we were to examine it closer, what we would find is that our lives are composed of these individual moments. And that what happens is that are those individual moments, connecting them, assuming that there's a causal link between them when there may or may not be. And the best way I can explain what Bachelard is trying to say here is for you to think back on individual memories. We kind of think of our childhood as a whole, but when we think back on our childhood, what we're remembering is specific instances from our childhood. And we put our childhood, we can put our childhood together as a whole and say that we had a happy childhood or a sad childhood, or that we had good parents or bad parents. But what we are doing is creating this overarching narrative that exists in one level. And this might not be a great way to explain it, but you have the individual events down here, and you have the narrative as a whole that connects those events. And what Bachlard's saying is that we have to understand that although we may think that that narrative is based off of a sort of causation that existed in the past, that it's our consciousness that's creating that narrative, that narrative in and of itself does not exist in our past. And that's important for the concept of rhythm analysis. And I'll leave this video relatively short because I realize I've been rambling, and I'll make a part 2, maybe part 3 of this video. But what Bachelard says with rhythm analysis is that not only do these events have occurred in the past and we've created this narrative, but what the reason why Bachelard is going to create this idea of rhythm analysis is that that narrative that we creative is in itself constantly changing, that the events that we experienced are not fixed. I mean, they are fixed in the sense that the past has already happened. There's nothing that we can do about that. But how we interpret the past changes and can change and is always subject to change. So I'll leave it there as kind of a brief introduction to Bachelard's philosophy of time and rhythm analysis. And I'll pick up the next time by talking about some of the big influences that Bachelard is reacting to, if you're interested. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said in this video, of course, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll see you all next time. Thank you.